The morning was bitter cold, the kind that crept through layers of clothing and settled in the bones. Under the overpass, wedged between a concrete pillar and a rusted shopping cart, Elliot Granger opened his eyes. A thin ray of winter sunlight cut through the city haze, landing on his face. His blanket was damp, his shoes soaked from last night's rain. He sat up slowly, his joints stiff from another night spent on the ground. Above him, the sound of cars thundered across the overpass. Below, the city stirred to life. Footsteps echoed, horns blared, distant voices merged into a dull, urban hum. People passed by in coats and scarves, holding coffee cups, hurrying toward offices and warm lobbies. Elliot watched them the way a man might watch a movie about a life he no longer recognized. Once, years ago, he had been one of them. He had owned pressed shirts, a reliable car, a key that opened the door to a home filled with laughter. Now all he carried was a torn backpack, a frayed blanket, and memories that hurt more than hunger. A police cruiser pulled up at the curb. An officer stepped out, a young man with tired eyes, and approached him cautiously. "Morning," the officer said. "You can't stay here. You know that." Elliot didn't argue. He rarely did. He folded the damp blanket, shoved it into his bag, and stood up. His knees cracked as he straightened. "I'll move," he muttered. The officer nodded, almost apologetically, then returned to his car. It was a familiar routine, one Elliot had repeated in alleys, bus stations, parks, and abandoned lots all over the city. As he started walking down the sidewalk, a man in a suit passed by. Without looking, he tossed a coin into Elliot's path, as if feeding a pigeon. A group of teenagers nearby snickered, pointing at his ragged coat and matted hair. Elliot didn't react. He had learned that on the streets, dignity was a fragile luxury. Survival required silence more than pride. At the corner, a small van was parked. A woman with a clipboard was handing out hot coffee and pamphlets. Her name tag read, "Claire Thompson." She noticed Elliot and offered a warm smile. "Hey there," she said softly. "Would you like a cup?" Elliot hesitated, then nodded. The steam from the cup thawed his frozen fingers as he took a cautious sip. "There's a new shelter opening up near Harbor Street," Claire continued. "They've got beds for a few weeks, showers too." Elliot glanced at the pamphlet but didn't take it. "I'm fine," he said, though his shivering betrayed the lie. "I'm Claire," she added gently. "I'm around most mornings. If you ever want help getting off the street, come talk to me." He gave a faint nod, then walked away before she could say more. Hours later, Elliot sat on a bench near a busy intersection. The city buzzed around him, but he felt invisible, like a ghost haunting places he no longer belonged to. In the reflection of a storefront window, he saw his own face, unshaven, hollow-eyed, older than his 47 years, a man unrecognizable to himself. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the pavement as if answers might appear between the cracks. For a long moment he thought about what it would feel like to disappear completely. No one would notice, no one would miss him. He closed his eyes and exhaled slowly, a cloud of white breath dissolving into the cold morning air. That night, Elliot sat on the curb outside a soup kitchen, cradling a paper bowl of thin stew. The streetlights flickered above him, buzzing faintly. Around him, other men and women huddled in small groups, talking in low voices or eating in silence. The smell of damp concrete and cheap coffee hung in the air. Elliot wasn't really tasting the food. It was just something warm to hold. A young couple walked by on the opposite side of the street, pushing a stroller. The baby's laughter echoed across the empty road. It hit him like a brick to the chest. He turned his head sharply, pretending to focus on his shoes, but his throat tightened. He could still remember his daughter's laugh, high, bright, contagious. He could still hear his wife singing along to the radio as they drove through the suburbs, windows down, wind tangling her hair. 6 years had passed since that night. The highway had been slick with rain. He had worked a double shift on a construction site, too proud to admit he was exhausted. His wife, Amelia, had suggested she drive. He'd refused. "I'm fine," he'd said. Those words still echoed in his head every time he closed his eyes. The truck came out of nowhere, skidding across the lane. The impact was sudden, deafening, like the world itself had shattered. When Elliot woke up in the hospital, his ribs were broken, his face bruised, and both of them were gone. Amelia and little June, just like that. The days that followed blurred into one long nightmare: funeral arrangements, insurance calls, pitying faces, people telling him it wasn't your fault, as if those words could dig out the guilt lodged in his chest. He stopped answering calls. He stopped going to work. He drank to numb the screaming silence of the house. Within a year, he lost the house to the bank. The construction company let him go after too many no-shows. Friends visited at first, then stopped when he pushed them away. He told himself he didn't need anyone, but in truth he couldn't bear anyone seeing the wreckage he had become. One memory rose above the rest: the night he packed what little he had into 2 garbage bags, left the house key on the kitchen counter, and walked out. No plan, no destination, just gone. Elliot blinked, pulling himself back to the present. The soup kitchen volunteers were cleaning up. He placed his empty bowl in the trash and stood, adjusting the straps of his worn-out backpack. The couple with the stroller was long gone, but their laughter lingered like a ghost. He started walking aimlessly through the dark streets, passing glowing storefronts and warm apartments where silhouettes moved behind curtains. Every window felt like a world sealed off from him. He passed a bar and caught a whiff of whiskey. For a second, the urge clawed at him, that old temptation to drown everything again. But he kept walking. By the time he reached the overpass, the night had grown colder. He lay down on the damp cardboard he called a bed, pulled the thin blanket over himself, and stared at the underside of the bridge. He didn't cry anymore. Tears had run dry years ago. Now there was only the dull, relentless ache of someone who had already lost everything worth losing. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed. A train horn echoed. Elliot closed his eyes and let the sounds of the city wash over him. He didn't know it yet, but his life was about to change, not with a miracle, but with a letter. The morning came gray and wet, with a thin drizzle that clung to everything. Elliot sat on a bench near the bus terminal, watching people rush by under umbrellas. His blanket was folded at his feet, his hood pulled low. He had developed a routine: find a public place where he wouldn't be asked too many questions, stay out of the way, disappear into the background. That's why he noticed the man in the dark wool coat. He didn't belong to the usual city rhythm. He moved slowly, scanning faces as if searching for someone specific. His shoes were polished. A leather briefcase hung from his hand. When his eyes met Elliot's, he stopped. For a second, Elliot looked away. He was used to being glanced over, not at. But the man approached, deliberate and calm. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice steady. "Are you Elliot Granger?" Elliot stiffened. It had been years since anyone had said his full name aloud. He eyed the man cautiously. "Who's asking?" The man reached into his coat and produced a business card, holding it out between 2 fingers. "Daniel Harper, attorney at law." His voice softened slightly. "I've been trying to find you. It wasn't easy." Elliot didn't take the card. "I'm not interested in whatever you're selling." "This isn't about money," Daniel replied. "Not in that sense. It's about an inheritance." Elliot almost laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Yeah, sure. Happens all the time. Homeless guy wins the lottery. Next, you'll ask for my bank account." Daniel remained composed. He opened his briefcase, pulled out a folder, and flipped it open. Inside were legal documents with Elliot's name typed clearly at the top. "I assure you this is legitimate. A distant relative of yours, Margaret Whitmore, passed away 3 months ago. You're listed as the sole beneficiary of her estate." Elliot frowned. The name was familiar, buried somewhere deep. Margaret? He searched his memory. His mother's cousin, maybe? He hadn't seen her since he was a child. She'd lived out of state, a quiet woman who sent Christmas cards until his parents died. Then contact had faded. Daniel watched his face carefully. Her property has been sitting vacant. The estate is modest, but it includes a house in Pinewood. She didn't have any children or living siblings. You're the last direct relative. Elliot shook his head. This is crazy. He stood, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. Look, man, I don't know what kind of scam this is, but you're wasting your time. He started to walk away. Mr. Granger, Daniel called after him, raising his voice just enough to cut through the rain. This isn't a joke. You have 30 days to claim the inheritance before the state takes possession. Please, at least come to my office and read the documents. Elliot stopped under the dripping edge of a bus shelter. The lawyer's words echoed in his head. 30 days. Inheritance. A house. It all sounded like something that happened to other people, not to someone who hadn't had a mailing address in years. He turned slowly. Why me? Why now? Daniel closed his briefcase with a quiet click. Because whether you believe it or not, you're family, and legally, this is yours. What you do with it is up to you, but you should at least know what's on the table. Elliot didn't answer. He stared at the lawyer, trying to read his face. The man didn't have the slick smile of a con artist. His eyes were steady, patient. But Elliot's instinct was to mistrust everything that sounded too good. Life had taught him that promises usually came with strings. Fine, Elliot muttered. One visit. That's it. Daniel nodded once, as if expecting that. He handed him a clean, folded piece of paper, the office address. Tomorrow at 10. I'll be waiting. When the lawyer walked away, disappearing into the misty street, Elliot stood there for a long moment, holding the paper. Rain gathered at its edges, threatening to smear the ink. He folded it carefully and tucked it into his jacket. He didn't understand why. Maybe some small, stubborn part of him wanted to believe that life could hand him something other than loss. The law office didn't look like the kind of place Elliot ever imagined himself walking into again. The building stood on a quiet street just off downtown. Brick walls, tall windows, a brass plaque beside the door. Inside, the air smelled of paper, polish, and freshly brewed coffee. He felt out of place the moment he stepped inside. His boots left faint, wet marks on the spotless tile floor. A young receptionist with neat hair and sharp eyes looked him up and down with a mixture of politeness and curiosity. "Can I help you?" Elliot Granger. I'm here to see Daniel Harper," he mumbled. Her expression shifted to practiced professionalism. "Of course, Mr. Granger. He's expecting you." She led him to a small waiting area, leather chairs, a clock ticking softly on the wall. Elliot sat stiffly, his hands buried in the pockets of his frayed jacket. He couldn't remember the last time he'd been in a place where silence wasn't filled with traffic, shouting, or sirens. It made him uneasy. The door opened, and Daniel Harper appeared, smiling warmly. "Mr. Granger, you came." Elliot stood awkwardly. "Yeah, one visit, like I said." "Fair enough," Daniel replied. "Come on in." His office was lined with bookshelves stacked with legal volumes and framed photographs. Rain tapped lightly against the window behind his desk. Elliot stayed standing until Daniel gestured toward the chair opposite him. Daniel opened the same folder Elliot had seen the day before and spread several documents across the desk. "I know this must feel overwhelming," he began, "but everything here is legitimate. Margaret Whitmore was your mother's cousin. She lived alone most of her life in Pinewood, a small town about 2 hours from here. She passed away quietly at home. You're the only living relative on record." Elliot leaned forward slightly, eyes scanning the pages. He saw his name typed neatly on multiple documents. The legal language was dense, but one line stood out clearly. Sole beneficiary, Elliot James Granger. Daniel continued, "The property is a 2-story house with a yard. It hasn't been occupied since her passing. It's a bit run down, but structurally sound. If you choose to claim it, the process is straightforward. I'll handle the paperwork. However, the law requires that you accept or decline the inheritance within 30 calendar days. After that, ownership automatically transfers to the state. Elliot sat back in the chair. Why would she leave it to me? I barely knew her. She didn't have children, Daniel explained, and apparently she kept track of family quietly. She had your name in her will for years. It didn't make sense. Elliot's life had been one long series of losses and disappointments. A house left to him by some distant relative felt like a cruel joke. He looked at the papers again, half expecting them to dissolve into smoke. Daniel studied him for a moment. I understand this might seem unbelievable, but I can assure you this isn't a scam. If you like, we can visit the property tomorrow. See it with your own eyes. Elliot rubbed his forehead. Even if this is real, I don't belong in a house like that anymore. Belonging is a funny thing, Daniel replied gently. Sometimes it's just about deciding to walk through the door. Elliot didn't respond. He signed nothing, took nothing, just sat there, lost between disbelief and fear. When the meeting ended, Daniel handed him a simple information packet. Think it over, he said. You don't have to decide today, but don't wait too long. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets shining like mirrors. Elliot walked with the packet clutched in his hand. He stopped under an awning, opened it, and stared at a photo of the house. White paint peeling, shutters crooked, weeds swallowing the front steps. It didn't look like a miracle. It looked like work, years of it. And yet, it was shelter, walls, a roof, a place with a lock on the door. That night, back under the overpass, he spread the photo beside him on the cardboard. The distant sound of trains echoed through the darkness. He traced the outline of the house with his finger. He couldn't picture himself inside it, not yet. He lay awake for hours, caught between the life he knew and a possibility he didn't trust. 2 days later, Elliot found himself sitting in the passenger seat of Daniel Harper's car, the first real car ride he'd taken in years. He stared out the window as the city slowly gave way to highways lined with thinning trees and weathered billboards. The hum of the tires on the wet asphalt filled the silence between them. Daniel glanced over at him once or twice, but didn't press for conversation. Elliot appreciated that. Talking wasn't something he did easily anymore. As they drove deeper into the countryside, Elliot felt a strange tightness in his chest. It wasn't excitement. It was fear, the kind that came from standing at the edge of something you've convinced yourself you no longer deserve. Pinewood appeared suddenly, like a town out of another time. Modest houses, quiet streets, an old gas station with a hand-painted sign. The car turned down a narrow road lined with oaks whose branches hung low, dripping from last night's rain. There it is, Daniel said softly. Elliot leaned forward. The house sat at the end of the street, slightly elevated on a small hill. White paint peeled from the siding in wide strips. The shutters leaned at odd angles. The yard was overgrown with weeds and wildflowers. A rusted mailbox leaned sideways, the name Whitmore barely visible through the flaking paint. It wasn't grand, it wasn't pretty, but it was a house. As they parked at the bottom of the driveway, Elliot noticed 2 figures standing on a neighboring porch, a man and a woman, both in their 60s. The man crossed his arms, watching with a cautious, slightly suspicious expression. The woman whispered something to him, and they both continued to stare as Elliot stepped out of the car. "This is it," Daniel said, unlocking the front door with an old brass key. "Hasn't been touched since the will was settled. Utilities are off, but structurally it's in decent shape." Elliot followed him inside. The air smelled of dust and wood. Light filtered weakly through grimy windows. Furniture was covered in white sheets like sleeping ghosts. He ran his fingers across a dusty picture frame and uncovered a photo of Margaret, older, gray-haired, with a kind smile. He barely remembered her face. Daniel moved through the house, pointing out rooms, but Elliot barely listened. He wandered slowly, his boots creaking on the floorboards. The kitchen tiles were cracked. A spider had spun a massive web in the corner of the living room. Upstairs, a bedroom held a single bed and a dresser. On the windowsill sat a small ceramic bird, the only touch of warmth in the entire house. He sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress squeaking beneath his weight. For the first time in years, he was surrounded by 4 solid walls and silence. Not the restless noise of the streets, real silence. It unsettled him. Outside, he heard a car passing, then the distant sound of a dog barking. No sirens, no shouting. Just quiet. "Elliot?" Daniel's voice came from downstairs. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," Elliot answered after a moment. His voice echoed faintly through the empty house. They spent another half-hour walking through the property. The roof needed work, the porch steps were loose, and the garden was a jungle. But Daniel's words stuck with him, structurally sound. The bones were good. As they were leaving, the neighbors were still on their porch. Daniel waved politely. The man gave a curt nod in return. Elliot kept his eyes down. He could feel their gaze like a weight on his back, a stranger arriving in a quiet neighborhood, carrying a past no one could see. Back in the car, as they started the drive home, Daniel said carefully, "It's not perfect, but it's yours, Elliot. All of it." Elliot stared at the house through the rearview mirror until it disappeared behind the trees. He didn't say anything. Inside him, something small stirred. Not hope exactly, but the memory of what it felt like to have something that was his. That night, back under the overpass, he couldn't sleep. He kept seeing the house, the cracked tiles, the ceramic bird, the way the bed held his weight without question. For the first time in years, cardboard didn't feel like enough. Elliot returned to the house a week later, this time alone. He carried everything he owned in a single torn duffel bag, a change of clothes, a few crumpled photos, and a half-broken harmonica he'd found years ago. The social worker had left him a temporary set of keys. When the old brass key turned in the lock, it made a sharp metallic click that echoed through the empty halls. For a long moment, he just stood in the doorway, unsure whether to step inside. The house was silent. Not the kind of silence filled with danger, like under bridges at night, but a hollow, almost judgmental quiet. Elliot's fingers tightened on the strap of his bag. He closed the door behind him and exhaled slowly. He was in. The first few days were awkward. He slept on the dusty bed with his shoes still on, as if ready to leave at any moment. He didn't use the kitchen, just drank bottled water and ate what he brought with him. Every sound, a creaking floorboard, a gust of wind rattling a window, made his heart jump. He wasn't used to stillness. It felt foreign, even threatening. Outside, the neighbors watched. Every time he stepped onto the porch, the couple across the street, the Dawsons, seemed to appear out of nowhere. They didn't say anything, but their eyes followed him. One afternoon, he overheard the woman whisper, "He's the one who inherited Margaret's place," to another neighbor. The man replied in a low, skeptical voice, "Looks like trouble to me." It stung more than Elliot wanted to admit. He wasn't naive. He knew how he looked. Unshaven, clothes worn thin, shoulders tense from years on the street. But hearing it confirmed was different. It made the house feel less like a home and more like enemy territory. On the third evening, Elliot tried to clean. He swept the floor, wiped dust off surfaces, and opened the windows to let in fresh air. But the more he cleaned, the more memories crept in, memories he'd tried to bury. This house wasn't just Margaret's. It was where he'd spent a few quiet afternoons as a child, sitting at her kitchen table while she made him tea. She had been the only person in his chaotic family who ever treated him with steady kindness. And now she was gone. He was left with her house, but not her warmth. At night, sleep came in fragments. Sometimes he woke up convinced he was back under the bridge, reaching for a blanket that wasn't there. Other times, he stared at the ceiling for hours, wondering what he was doing there. He wasn't a homeowner. He was a man who'd learned to survive with nothing. Having something again made him uneasy, almost guilty. The first real confrontation happened 5 days after he moved in. Elliot walked to the small convenience store in town to buy cleaning supplies. As he stood in line, a man behind him muttered, just loud enough for him to hear, "Didn't know they were letting guys like him move in around here." Elliot froze. He turned his head slightly. The man was middle-aged, wearing a work uniform, looking at him with thinly veiled disdain. Elliot wanted to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. He paid quickly and left. Outside, 2 teenagers on bikes rode past, laughing. One pointed at him and whispered something to the other. The sound of their laughter lingered after they were gone. That night, Elliot sat on the porch steps long after sunset, staring at the quiet street. A light breeze carried the smell of freshly cut grass, something he hadn't noticed in years. He wanted to belong, but belonging wasn't something he could just walk into. It had to be earned, and in this town, it seemed the odds were already stacked against him. Inside, he found himself standing in front of the mirror in the upstairs bathroom. For the first time in ages, he looked at himself. Really looked. The face staring back was tired, lined, and unfamiliar. He ran a hand over his uneven stubble and thought, maybe they're right. Maybe I don't belong here. He turned off the light and went to bed without brushing his teeth. But deep down, a quiet thought resisted the despair. This is mine now. The house wasn't asking him to prove anything. It was just there, waiting. The question was whether Elliot could meet it halfway. The first letter arrived folded neatly in his mailbox. Elliot almost didn't notice it. He wasn't used to checking mail. The envelope was plain with no return address, just his name written in shaky cursive, to the new resident of 24 Oak Lane. Inside was a single sheet of paper. We've heard about your situation. Pinewood is a quiet neighborhood, and we'd like to keep it that way. We hope you'll be respectful of the community's standards. Any problems will be reported to the town council. Concerned neighbors. Elliot read it 3 times. There was nothing openly threatening, but the message was clear. We're watching you. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it into a drawer. He told himself it didn't matter. But that night, when he tried to sleep, he kept replaying the words in his mind like a broken record. Quiet neighborhood. Keep it that way. The next few days, the subtle pressure grew louder. When he walked down the street, conversations would pause mid-sentence. At the grocery store, the cashier's polite smile didn't reach her eyes. At the gas station, 2 men leaned against a truck, watching him silently as he filled a gas can for the lawnmower he'd borrowed. Elliot wasn't doing anything wrong. He mowed the lawn, fixed a broken step on the porch, and tried to keep to himself. But no matter what he did, he could feel the invisible wall between him and the town. One morning, as he was repairing a loose shutter, a woman in a floral blouse approached the property. She held a clipboard against her chest, like a shield. "Mr. Whitmore?" she asked cautiously. "Yes," he replied, setting down his hammer. "I'm Linda Clark. I work with the town's community board. I just wanted to welcome you officially to Pinewood." Her smile was tight, formal. "We have some community expectations for homeowners here. Lawn maintenance, noise levels, upkeep. You understand?" Elliot nodded. "I'm working on it." "Good," she said quickly, already turning to leave. "I'll be checking in periodically. We want to make sure everything stays orderly." Her choice of words hung in the air like a warning. 2 days later, a man from social services came by, not Daniel, but someone new. He was younger, dressed neatly, with a tablet tucked under his arm. "I just need to do a routine check," he said. "Whenever someone inherits property through a social program, we have to ensure the transition is stable." Elliot let him in. The man walked through the house, noting every crack in the wall, every uneven floorboard. He asked questions Elliot wasn't sure how to answer. "Do you have stable income? Any plans for renovations? Are you prepared to handle property taxes when they come due?" Each question chipped away at Elliot's fragile sense of security. He answered honestly, "No, not yet, maybe." "Well," the man said finally, tapping on his tablet, If you need help, there are programs. But you'll have to show consistent progress. The town can't let this property fall into neglect." After he left, Elliot sat at the kitchen table, staring at the blank wall. The house no longer felt like a gift. It felt like a test he wasn't sure he could pass. The final blow came one evening as he returned from a walk. A group of teenagers had gathered near the edge of his property, tossing pebbles at the mailbox and laughing. When they saw him, one of them called out, "Hey, hobo house, you fixing it up for the rats or for yourself?" Elliot froze. He wasn't a confrontational man, but something inside him snapped. "Get off my property," he said firmly, his voice low. They laughed even louder. "Relax, old man," one said. "We're just saying hi." Elliot stepped closer. The teens backed away slowly, still grinning, and disappeared down the street. But their laughter echoed long after they were gone. He stood there for a while, staring at the dented mailbox, breathing heavily. He had spent years being invisible. Now, for the first time, people saw him, and they didn't like what they saw. That night, he lay awake listening to the creaks of the house. For the first time, he wondered if this place was really his, or if it was just another temporary stop before being pushed out again. The week following the confrontation with the teenagers was the hardest of Elliot's life. Every sound outside the house, laughter, footsteps, a car door slamming, made him tense, ready to retreat into the small, familiar corners of the rooms. The weight of years on the streets pressed down on him like the damp air of a subway tunnel. He could feel the invisible eyes of the neighborhood following him wherever he went. It all came to a head one rainy evening. Elliot had just finished fixing a loose step on the front porch when he saw it. The mailbox dented, its flag bent almost completely backward. His chest tightened. Someone had thrown a rock, and the laughter of the teenagers echoed faintly in the distance. This time, the anger surged through him unchecked. He grabbed a flashlight and stormed toward the edge of the property, his heart hammering. No one was there, only the dripping shadows of trees and the empty street. For a long moment he stood in the rain, fists clenched, screaming into the night. Not words, just raw sound, his grief and frustration spilling out for the first time in years. Inside, dripping and trembling, he sank to the floor, the house holding him in a silence that wasn't judgmental, but patient. It didn't leave. It didn't demand anything. It just existed. And for the first time, Elliot felt the faintest glimmer of understanding. The house didn't care who he had been. It didn't care about the streets, the bridges, the concrete corners where he had survived. It cared only that he was here now. The next morning, Elliot awoke with a resolve he hadn't felt in years. He cleaned every surface he could reach, set the furniture straight, and even found a broom for the overgrown garden. Every stroke of the broom, every swipe of the rag, was a small reclaiming of not just the property, but himself. The house was not perfect, but neither was he. And that didn't mean they couldn't belong together. Over the following weeks, Elliot started to leave traces of his presence that weren't hidden away. He planted a small patch of flowers near the porch. He hung a curtain in the living room. He lit candles in the windows during the evenings. Slowly, the neighbors began to notice, first the Dawsons, then Linda Clark from the community board. Their expression softened. Their cautious whispers became nods of acknowledgement. One afternoon, while Elliot repaired the loose railing on the porch, a small group of children from the neighborhood approached him cautiously. "Hi," one of them said. "We like your flowers." Elliot laughed softly, a sound that startled even himself. "Thanks," he replied, and for the first time in years, he felt a small, genuine connection to the world around him. Months passed. The house remained a work in progress, but it was home. Elliot learned to live with the silence and with the occasional judgment of those around him. The community that had once been cold and watchful started to accept him. Not fully, not yet, but the walls of suspicion were breaking. On a quiet Sunday morning, Elliot sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, looking over the yard. A neighbor waved from across the street. He waved back, and a small smile spread across his face. This wasn't just the house, it was a life being slowly rebuilt. Elliot thought about the streets, the bridges, the nights when he had felt invisible. He thought about Margaret and how she had left him this unexpected chance. Life had taken everything, but somehow, through loss, pain, and years of wandering, he had arrived here, standing on the porch of a home that was truly his. It wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't an instant redemption. There were still scars, both visible and hidden, that would take a lifetime to fade. But Elliot had discovered something he hadn't felt in years: stability, belonging, a place where he could close the door behind him and at last breathe. The final chapter of his street-worn life was not a grand miracle, but a quiet victory. The city that had cast him aside, the town that had watched him with suspicion, and the streets that had hardened him, they were all part of the story that brought him here. A story of endurance, grief, and the slow, painstaking return to life. Elliot leaned back, letting the warmth of the morning sun wash over him. For the first time in decades, he didn't feel the cold pressing against his bones. He had survived, yes, but more importantly, he had arrived. He was home.